It began like any other morning in Joe's diner in Pine Haven, Pennsylvania, until the sound of motorcycles broke the stillness. The 92-year-old woman who was stealthily eating her breakfast was the incorrect target for the Black Vipers, the most dreaded gang in 3 states. They were unable to recognize Eleanor Ellie Harper as more than a mere senior citizen. The fierce determination of a Korean War combat nurse, who had saved more than 150 men in enemy territory and received more medals than any of them had criminal charges, was hidden under her kind smile. Their commander Raven snarled, "Grandma, you have an hour to leave town." What did Ellie say? One phone call. Pine Haven would see something remarkable by sunset. The woman the Black Vipers had just threatened had saved the lives of 60 battle-hardened veteran bikers who were rolling in. But justice and retribution weren't the only things that transpired thereafter. It told the story of how one woman's bravery altered a small Pennsylvania town forever and turned a group of seasoned criminals into something no one could have imagined. A brief silence before we go on. Please let us know where you are watching from. Make sure to hit subscribe if you're liking these stories, as tomorrow's episode is going to be incredible. The main thoroughfare of Pine Haven was painted in amber and gold on the first autumn morning. Even at 92, Ellie Harper maintained her military straight posture as she entered Richardson's diner, her silver hair catching the early light. As she walked in, the smell of bacon and coffee surrounded her like an old friend, and the familiar bell chimed over the door. "Good morning, Miss Ellie." Grace Richardson was already grabbing for the coffee pot when she called from behind the counter. Typical. Ellie took her seat in the corner booth that she had been using every morning for the previous 30 years. "Thank you, my love. What's up with your dad?" "Better today." Grace poured the coffee as easily as she had practiced. "Physical treatment is beneficial. He's even considering returning to work on a part-time basis the following week." Due to a recent fall, Edward Richardson, the diner's 40-year owner, was unable to work. Although she kept those thoughts to herself, Ellie recalled treating similar injuries in Korea. Regular patrons of the diner began to trickle in. Dave, the school bus driver, Sarah from the flower store, and Frank the mailman. In a town that had mostly escaped the problems plaguing other areas, ordinary people were leading normal lives. So far. Beginning as a distant thunderclap, the rumble grew louder until it filled the early air. Motorbikes. Many, not just one or two. The diner reverberated with the sound. Talk ceased. Halfway to the lips, the cups froze. People turned to look at the windows. Grace placed down the coffee pot, her fingers trembling slightly, and muttered, "Oh no. Not them. Not in this place." Pine Haven has been spared until lately, despite the Black Vipers attacking villages in 3 states. They were becoming more audacious now. Requesting protection funds from companies. Frightening anyone who opposed them. 3 Main Street businesses have already been forced to close by the gang. 6 motorcycles entered the parking lot of the diner. The early sun was shining on their chrome. Practiced arrogance, the riders dismounted. They wore leather vests with patches of the black serpent. Blood-red eyes on a coiling serpent. A head higher than the others was their leader, a guy they called Raven. The bell jangled discordantly as the door of the diner flung open. Raven and his lieutenants went in first. Hunter, Knight, Scorpion, Panther, and Falcon. In an attempt to blend in with their booths, the early crowd appeared to thin out. Raven's voice echoed across the diner, well. Isn't this comfortable? Like one of those paintings by Norman Rockwell." Grace took a step closer and spoke in a scarcely steady voice. "Gentlemen, may I be of assistance?" Coffee everywhere, black. Raven looked around the diner, perhaps chatting with the owner about our new business agreement, counting witnesses, and noting exits. "My dad isn't here," Grace said. "It's unfortunate." At the counter, Raven drew out a chair, its metal legs scuffing the floor. "We'll have to wait, I suppose." Despite everything, Ellie kept eating her breakfast, carefully slicing her eggs into small pieces. Raven noticed the movement. Most people would freeze when they walked into a room, but this elderly woman pretended not to be there. "Grandma, hello." Raven walked over to her booth, his boots thudding on the floor. "Are you deaf or what? When we enter, most people treat us with more respect." After putting down her fork and wiping her mouth with a napkin, Ellie turned to face Raven. Without showing any signs of fear, her eyes met his, as clear and keen as mountain water. With a voice that rang loudly through the quiet dining room, she said, "Respect. Young dude, he earned it. Not required." It appeared that the diner held its breath. Raven put his hands on Ellie's table and leaned down, his expression darkening. "Old woman, perhaps you don't know how things operate these days. We live in this town. Is it?" Ellie's voice didn't waver. "Odd. I've spent 40 years here. Served my nation. Watched kids grow up and start their own families. I don't remember seeing you at any of our volunteer days or town meetings. What specifically have you done to assert your ownership to Pine Haven, please?" Raven's jaw twitched a muscle. "Grandma, one final caution. Be respectful, or what?" Ellie interrupted in a gentle yet razor-sharp manner. "Will you frighten an elderly woman? Threaten someone you believe is incapable of defending yourself to show off your strength? I've delivered infants amid mortar assaults, treated gunshot wounds during firefights, and rescued individuals who had given up on ever seeing another morning. Young dude, you don't scare me. I'm sad because of you." Raven stood up straight and reached for his jacket. "You are about to be taught a difficult lesson on." "No." His threat was interrupted short by Ellie's voice. "Yes, you are." Her motions were leisurely as she grabbed for her handbag. "I am going to make a phone call, you see. You and your friends will gain knowledge about genuine strength, genuine respect, and the true meaning of belonging to a community when I do." She stood, moving with dignity and accuracy. As she approached the door, the black vipers automatically parted, then appeared to recognize that a 92-year-old woman was intimidating them. Anger heated Raven's face. "No one leaves us," he growled. "No one." At the door, Ellie stopped and gave him a sympathetic glance in return. "The issue with bullies is that it's always too late before they realize they've been beaten." She looked at her timepiece. "You have around an hour to reevaluate your life decisions, in my opinion." She then grinned, and Raven briefly recoiled when he noticed something in her eyes. "We'll see what sort of lesson you're prepared to absorb, then." With a soft chime, the door shut behind her, and the diner fell silent. In an attempt to conceal his discomfort with bluster, Raven turned to his group. He told them to follow her. "See who she calls." The black vipers are not threatened. Raven was unaware that Ellie Harper had already taken out her phone as two of his men rushed out. After all these years, her fingers remained steady as she called a number she hadn't used in a long time. Her voice held the same authority it did in Korean field hospitals decades before, and the call went through. "It's Ellie Harper, John. Do you recall the pledge you made in '53? I'm going to call it in, then. You are needed in Pine Haven. You are necessary to me." John Iron Jack Patterson, who lived in a small home outside of Pittsburgh 200 miles distant, slowly dropped his phone as memories flooded back like a torrent. He was immediately taken back to a soggy night in Korea in 1953, when a young battle nurse had persisted in helping him and his soldiers, by the sound of Ellie Harper's voice. He had a picture on his wall of himself as a child, standing next to a chopper from a MASH unit. Ellie was also present. Blood and muck spattered her outfit. She had a resolute expression in her eyes that stated she would stop at nothing to save another soldier. She'd done just that evening. The Veterans Alliance patch was traced by Iron Jack's grizzled hands as they sought for his leather vest. It had been some days since he had worn it, but now. It was time now. He made his own call, and his powerful, commanding voice filled the place. Sound the alarm, Marcus. Complete mobilization. In Pine Haven, we have a debt to settle. In the meantime, Raven paced between the tables inside Richardson's diner, his seeming anxiousness undermining his attempt at intimidation. With a flush of desperation, Falcon rushed through the door. "We're in trouble, boss. Iron Jack Patterson just hung up with that elderly woman." Raven felt the name as if it were a bodily blow. Some names carried weight, even among outlaws. Among them was Iron Jack Patterson. The alliance of the veteran? Raven's voice broke a little bit. What does she do with such connections? Panther, who had been looking at his phone, raised his head in alarm. Things worsen. I had been inquiring about her. Harper, Eleanor. Nurse in combat. The Korean War. More than 150 successful rescue missions. She was referred to as the Angel of Incheon. It took us a long time to prepare and tell this narrative. Please subscribe to our channel if you find it entertaining. It is really important to us. Let's return to the narrative. Emma Bradford from the VA Center stormed into Chief George Hamilton's office at the Pine Haven Police Station as he was going over reports of increased black serpent activity. Her normally calm manner was tinged with enthusiasm. "You must see this, Chief." On his desk, she placed her tablet. 3 states' worth of veterans motorcycle clubs are organizing. A significant event is taking place. Hamilton's expression darkened as he studied the data. Does this relate to our unwanted guests in any way? Like the person they threatened this morning, more precisely. Emma opened a second file. Harper, Ellie. She isn't your typical veteran. Just the medals. I recognize Ellie, Hamilton said quietly. During my first deployment, I served beside her. I'm not sure why every military veteran with a motorcycle is coming our way. The solution was already traveling through Pennsylvania on highways. Iron Jack was the leader of the first group. 60 motorcycles in perfect formation. Weekend cyclists were not pretending to be tough. These were men who had witnessed actual battle and knew what sacrifice and fraternity really meant. At the clubhouse of the Black Serpent, a repurposed warehouse on the outskirts of town, Raven was beginning to lose control of his meticulously maintained persona. As affiliated gangs called with warnings, his phone kept ringing. Scorpion watched his boss pace and warned that the Veterans Alliance is not like other MCs. They are disciplined, organized, and former military personnel. Do you think I'm unaware of that? Raven struck a wall with his fist. We can't give up, though. That's what we do. Everything we have created here is lost. Hunter, keeping an eye on social media, raised his voice. The Veterans Alliance isn't the only one. Other clubs are mobilizing as well. Every veteran. All somehow related to the nurse. Back at her little house, Ellie was peacefully drinking tea in her favorite armchair. She could see members of Black Serpent trying to keep a covert eye on her home through her window. They constantly checking their phones, which was a sign of their anxiousness. Their agitated motions. Emma Bradford, carrying an armful of files, knocked on Ellie's door. Over the years, the VA coordinator had taken on the role of Ellie's surrogate daughter. Emma put the files down and reported that everyone in the town was discussing. News of what transpired at the diner is getting out. However, Ellie. Are you certain about this? The Alliance of Veterans? They are not your typical motorcycling club. No, Ellie concurred. Her eyes grew hazy with recollection. There is much more to them than that. Now all those men are riding toward Pine Haven. I can recall each one. Their faces. Their injuries. Their anxieties during the toughest moments of conflict. And each and every one of them promised me something. What sort of assurance? That they would be there for me if I ever needed them. As if I had been there for them. Ellie's tone grew softer. Patterson, John. Iron Jack. In '53, I rescued him and his whole team from an ambush. I wouldn't leave without them, even though the chopper was heavily hit. At that time, he assured me that the debt will be paid back. Emma looked closely at the elder woman. There is no easy escape for the Black Vipers. Ravens has too much involved in this and too much pride. According to Ellie, pride is frequently the last thing someone gives up. However, they will give it up in one form or another. Because there will be no retaliation or violence in the future. It's all about imparting knowledge that some people can only acquire via hardship. Raven assembled his entire crew on the edge of Pine Haven. Their motorcycles were arranged like intimidating weapons. However, doubt entered his voice for the first time since he had founded the Black Vipers. "Get the word out," he said. "Request the assistance of all affiliated clubs. By nightfall, I want numbers here. We'll give them a memorable one if they wish to demonstrate force." Raven was unable to comprehend that genuine force was unrelated to numerical values. It was all about the burnt ties, the decades-old vows, and the silent power of a 92-year-old woman who had faced greater dangers than himself in unimaginable locations. The sky was turning crimson and amber as the sun started to set over Pine Haven. In the distance, the boom of oncoming motorcycles became louder by the second. Nothing in Pine Haven would ever be the same again, and the lesson was about to start. The first rumble of incoming motorcycles reverberated through Pine Haven just as the sun had begun to set. This was not the Black Viper's frenzied roar. It was distinct, a well-timed beat that conveyed focus and discipline. The last of the light fell on Iron Jack's Veterans Alliance jacket as he led the procession. Behind him, 60 motorcycles rode in perfect formation, the military expertise of their riders showing in every step of their approach. Despite his recent injuries, Edward Richardson watched the veterans arrive into Richardson's cafe from the window. Grace gave his arm a light pat. "You ought to be sleeping, Dad." "Not today," Edward said in an emotionally charged tone. "My brother was saved in Korea by Ellie Harper. I didn't tell her I was aware. It was time for me to pay back that debt." After making a single lap around Main Street, the Veterans Alliance bikers positioned themselves strategically around the town. Dismounting in front of the diner, Iron Jack moved with the same command that characterized his military career. Even though he had aged since Korea, Ellie could still see the intensity in his eyes from that rainy night in 1953. From their position close to the town square, Raven and his Black Vipers observed, their former bluster ebbing away with every veteran who arrived. The two groups were very different from one another. The Veterans Alliance exuded a calm assurance that came from genuine experience, in contrast to the Black Vipers' use of intimidation. Raven said, "They're just old men on bikes," but his tone was unconvinced. His second in charge, Dennis Axel Reynolds, wasn't really certain. "Maybe we ought to, boss." "What should be done?" Raven jerked. "Run. Hide. Let us be driven out by a geriatric nurse and her cavalry from a retirement home." Walking carefully into the heart of the encroaching storm, Ellie came out of the diner. Decades of shared history passed between them as Iron Jack met her halfway and they just stared at one another. "You came," stated Ellie plainly. "Didn't I say I would?" The square echoed with Iron Jack's shout. November 15, 1953. "To save us, you flew into hell. Stated that if you ever needed me, I would move heaven and earth." Out of habit, Dr. Charles Armstrong rushed out of his automobile with his medical bag in hand. Few people in the town were aware that he had served as the surgeon at the MASH unit where Ellie was stationed. He joined them and stated, like old times, but hoped there would be less incoming fire. Raven lost patience. With forced bravado, he rolled forward, roaring the motor of his bike. "This is incredibly heartwarming. Reunited, the Geriatric Brigade. However, this is now our town. Something in Iron Jack's stance caused Raven's supporters to sway backward as he turned. You've been acting under some very false impressions, son. First, believing that intimidation is a good way to take over a town. Second, thinking that instilling fear is the source of strength. He pointed at Ellie and said, "But your biggest mistake was threatening someone who's saved more lives than you've lived years." As additional veterans took their places, the square's tension increased. With the accuracy of men who had never forgotten their training, they moved with ease and created a perimeter that made the Black Vipers appear more and more alone. With paperwork in hand, Emma Bradford handed them to Chief Hamilton as she left the VA center. "It's all documented. Every danger. Every racket for protection. Every intimidating act." Anger twisted Raven's face. "Do you think we're afraid of some paperwork and old war stories? We're not going anywhere. We own this land." Land? The tension was sliced like a surgeon's blade by Ellie's words. "Do you believe this is about that? Young fellow, let me tell you about region. My patients have bled for territory. We fought to defend territory, not to gain control of it. Do you wish to discuss territory? Here, show me what you've constructed. Tell me who you have assisted." A few members of the Black Vipers shifted uneasily. Axel discovered that he had a fresh perspective on the town plaza. The stores they had intimidated. The individuals they had threatened. In reality, what had any of it accomplished? With a commanding voice, Iron Jack took a step forward. "You have two options. We'll let the past remain in the past if we leave Pine Haven and never come back. Or stay and deal with the repercussions of every law you've committed here, in addition to us." Raven revved his engine once more, but this time it sounded hollow. "Old man, are you threatening me?" "No, son. You have my offer of salvation. More than you provided to everyone you frightened." There were additional headlights amid the deepening darkness. More veterans are coming in from neighboring states. With troops who had experienced worse odds in actual warfare, the Black Vipers were now outnumbered 3-1. As a reminder of the lives she had saved, Dr. Armstrong stepped forward to stand next to Ellie. "I recall what you used to say to the injured, Ellie. Sometimes knowing when to stop is more courageous than really fighting." Raven turned to find his carefully constructed facade of strength disintegrating. A few of his own soldiers were retreating, gaining a better understanding of the situation. But he refused to give up because of pride, the deadly weakness that had led him to this point. "It's not over," he growled. "Do you desire war? Let me show you a battle." "No," said Ellie coolly. "You'll demonstrate to us whether you're intelligent enough to take this opportunity to study. You are surrounded by men who have witnessed actual battle at this very moment. Men who know that being strong is about ending fear rather than inciting it." With Grace's help, Edward Richardson hobbled out of the diner. "Tommy, my brother, was saved at Incheon by Ellie. I didn't tell her I was aware. Been putting off paying back that debt for 30 years. Other townspeople came out one by one. Ellie's direct or indirect impact on the lives of those people. Their tales permeated the night air, weaving a web of interconnectedness that rendered the Black Serpent's attempts at intimidation look more and more flimsy. Uncertainty began to creep into Raven's face for the first time since he'd established the Black Serpents, yet his grip tightened on his handlebars. He was beginning to see that he was up against more than a bunch of elderly veterans. He was confronted with the essence of community. Of allegiance. Of obligations that went farther than terror could possibly go. The true test of strength was still to come, and the night was only getting started. However, Ellie noticed something familiar as she watched Raven struggle with his decisions. She had seen this conflict between pride and knowledge in innumerable young warriors. Whether he had learned the lesson before it was too late was the matter at hand. There was none of Raven's customary swagger in his escape from the town square. Then came his Black Vipers, whose formation was sloppy in comparison to the Veterans Alliance's orderly presence. However, Raven's shame turned into murderous hatred as they arrived at their clubhouse on the fringes of Pine Haven. He kicked over a chair and said, "Call everyone. All of our friends and associated gangs owe us. I want grieving all around this town." Axel became increasingly concerned as he observed his leader's increasing rage. He could still see the Veterans Alliance bikes moving with military accuracy down Main Street through the glass of the clubhouse. "Perhaps we ought to consider this seriously," Axel said. "They're not your typical bikers." Raven yelled, "They're old men living on past glory." But when he reached for his phone, his hands trembled. "What about that nurse? She will soon discover the consequences of confronting the Black Vipers." Emma Bradford and Chief Hamilton were going through papers at the VA center when she came across something that caused her to stop. "Look at this, Chief. His name is Michael Thompson, Raven. 10 years ago, his father, a Vietnam veteran, passed away at the VA hospital. The case of neglect was never settled." Hamilton's face darkened as he studied the paperwork. Emma concluded, "So his hatred of this town, of the VA, is personal. Ellie and the veterans have now forced him into a difficult situation." At Richardson's diner, Iron Jack and his veterans had set up a command center. Since he had insisted on remaining open, Edward Richardson had converted his restaurant into a makeshift headquarters. Iron Jack prepared defensive positions as the counter was covered with maps of Pine Haven. He assured Ellie, who sat quietly sipping her coffee, that they would strike back. Ravens always do. An excessive amount of pride. Too much rage. To their surprise, Ellie said, "Good. Sometimes healing cannot start until the poison has been removed." Bringing news from his contacts at nearby hospitals, Dr. Armstrong came in. "Reinforcements are being called in." This direction was validated by 3 affiliated gangs. The dusk has turned to full night outside. Members of the Veterans Alliance patrolled in pairs, using military-grade radio communications to coordinate their movements. In actual war zones, their chances had been worse. However, this was not like the others. This had to do with defending the home front. As she served coffee to soldiers and listened to their combat memories, Grace Richardson walked between tables. Ellie appeared in all of them. Here, a life was saved. There, a wound healed. Courage displayed in the face of adversity. "Your dad was one of mine," Ellie whispered to her. But he was unaware of it. His left shoulder was scarred. A piece of mortar. Incheon. He was treated by me, the nurse. The first troops started to arrive at the clubhouse of the Black Serpent. However, there was a problem. Only a small portion of their allies showed up where Raven had anticipated a display of overwhelming might. "The others are where?" He made a demand. Falcon made an uncomfortable move. "Word got out about our opponents. The Veterans Alliance will not be opposed by most riders. It's bad karma, they say. Disregarding the heroes of battle." Anger twisted Raven's features. Snatching up a bottle, he threw it against the wall. "Heroes? My father was left to pass away in their cherished VA hospital. Then, where were their morals? Their honor?" The room became silent at the realization. Axel gave his leader a fresh perspective. "Is that the true purpose of this? Your dad?" Raven argued that this was about power. However, there was a small crack in his voice. "About stealing what belongs to us. Is it?" To his surprise, Axel challenged. "Alternatively, is it about harming others because you're suffering yourself?" Axel staggered after Raven's fist struck him in the jaw. As members took sides, the clubhouse descended into mayhem. While several moved to assist Axel, others restrained Raven. Emma Bradford informed Chief Hamilton of the development while seeing through binoculars from the VA center. "They're breaking apart. Struggle within. Continue to observe, Hamilton said. First indication of weapons. We take up residence. This was a development that the Veterans Alliance had expected. Iron Jack arranged his troops to stop any bloodshed from breaking out. Their strategic placement demonstrates their expertise in crowd management. Ellie observed everything from her typical booth, her face attentive. On the other side of her was Dr. Armstrong. Words are superfluous because of their common experiences in Korea. At last, he continued, you were aware of Raven's father. When they first came to town, I went through all the VA records, Ellie said. Medical clinics, VA facilities, and the target pattern. It wasn't arbitrary. And now? We're waiting now. Reopening a wound is sometimes necessary for optimum healing. Charles, you taught me that. There was more deterioration at the clubhouse. Raven's wrath had changed into something erratic and dangerous. Ignoring the mounting resistance within his own ranks, he gave the order for his remaining devoted followers to arm themselves. Tonight, he said, his eyes burning with intent. We demonstrate to them the nature of true power. He didn't want to admit it, though, when he glanced around the room. His men's eyes were doubtful. They were unsure of their positions. The foundation of the Black Vipers had been intimidation and dread, but now they were up against something more powerful. Cohesion, direction, and the silent might of people who had actually fought. Axel made a choice that would alter everything as he wiped blood from his broken lip. He took out his phone and went outside to call someone. He dialed Iron Jack's number instead of Raven's. We have a problem, he stated softly. Raven has gone insane. He's talking about setting an example and arming himself. But territory is no longer a factor. It's intimate. Additionally, he isn't seeing clearly enough to recognize that he is going to cross a line from which we cannot return. Furthermore, there was a cold in the night air that was unrelated to temperature. Axel's admonition was met with grim comprehension by Iron Jack in Richardson's cafe. Respect and territory were no longer going to be the main points of contention. It concerned whether anyone could rescue a wounded guy from the depths of darkness before it was too late. As Raven initiated contact, Richardson's diner's windows were blazing with midnight oil. 3 Black Serpent's motorcycles thundered by, its riders flinging bottles through the VA center's windows. The eerie silence of the night was broken by the sound of glass cracking, but the Veterans Alliance was prepared. Their encrypted radio network crackled with Iron Jack's voice. Engage, Bravo Team. Charlie and Alpha, keep the perimeter intact. Veterans responded precisely and measuredly, moving with accustomed efficiency. The veterans swiftly contained the issue without escalation, whereas the Black Vipers caused havoc. Iron Jack protested, but Ellie stood inside the diner. Time, she firmly said. The truth about his father must be told to Raven. Emma Bradford hurried in with a heavy folder in her hand. Hold on, Ellie. I discovered something. The father of Raven. The VA did not neglect him. He signed out despite medical advice and refused treatment. After Vietnam, he had PTSD and lost faith in medical professionals. Dr. Armstrong noted discreetly that his son is not able to trust authority. Not all wounds from war bleed. The situation outside quickly worsened. The night was drowned out by the sound of their bikes as Raven led a larger group down Main Street. However, their formation had modified in some way. Due of Axel's stance against violence, about half of the Black Vipers were absent. Before he left, Axel had informed Raven, "You're throwing everything away. Everything we constructed. We based it on fear," Raven had said in a firm tone. "We're going to rebuild it on revenge now." Chief Hamilton held his officers back while tactically placing them. He told them to leave this to the veterans. Their language is the same. The altercation broke out in front of the VA facility. The ordered lines of the Veterans Alliance confronted Raven's surviving devoted followers, now reduced to hardly 20. There was a clear disparity in discipline. The veterans stood poised and prepared, while Raven's troops brimmed with anxious excitement. Ellie stepped forward, her voice echoing over the stalemate, "Your father wouldn't want this." She waved Iron Jack away as he moved to defend her. "I know William Thompson was a man of courage. I personally looked at his case." When his father's name was called, Raven's head sprang up. "You have no knowledge of him." "I am aware that in Vietnam, he received 2 Bronze Stars. I am aware that he suffered from PTSD, something we did not fully comprehend at the time. And I am certain that carelessness did not cause his death. His inability to accept assistance led to his death. After what he had witnessed, he was unable to trust." "Quit talking." Raven's voice broke as he roared his bike's engine. "You are not allowed to discuss him." With Grace's help, Edward Richardson hobbled out of his diner. "Son, she's right. Your father was someone I knew. In '71, we were in the same unit. Close to Khe Sanh, he saved my life." Raven felt the realization as if it were a bodily blow. For the first time, he was struck by how many connections were hidden beneath the surface of the town he had attempted to scare. At the opposite end of the street, Axel's crew emerged, their motorcycles rumbling softly. They had made their decision obvious by taking off their black serpent's patches. "Enough," Axel yelled. "Raven, look around you. Take a look at what you are truly fighting for." Raven, however, was irrational. He gave his surviving devoted supporters a nod, and they produced guns. Chains. Bats. Crude intimidation tools. The veterans established tactical dominance while defending civilians with military accuracy. "Are you curious about what true power looks like?" Hysterically, Raven's voice rose. "I'll demonstrate my might." On his bike, he charged forward, but the veterans had been trained for this very situation via decades of combat experience. Raven's own momentum was used against him as 2 riders moved in perfect unison. As his followers were easily subdued by veterans, his bike fell and rolled across the street. As Raven hit the floor, Dr. Armstrong's medical instincts kicked in and he hurried forward. "Son, stay down. Don't exacerbate this." Raven, however, scurried up and produced a concealed handgun. He was tackled from behind by Axel before he could lift it. The rifle stopped at Ellie's feet after skittering across the pavement. Raven struggled in Axel's grasp as the night froze in tableau. They were surrounded by veterans and ex-gang members, and Ellie Harper was staring down at the weapon that symbolized everything that was wrong with Raven's conception of power. With military accuracy, she cleared the chamber and ejected the magazine as she took up the rifle with ease. "Your father carried a similar model in Vietnam," she remarked quietly. "Did you know that he only ever used it to defend other people? Never once did you use it to control or intimidate." Something broke in Raven's face as he stopped struggling. "How do you know that, exactly?" "Because the day before he passed away, he told me. Son, I was there. When the painkillers eventually allowed him to tell about what he had seen and done, I was his nurse during those last few hours." His final remarks had nothing to do with power or retaliation. They have to do with hope. Wish for his son to discover a better path. Raven's strength diminished as the reality of his father's final moments dawned on him. His surviving devoted followers, sensing the change in the night's energy, dropped their weapons around them. Emma Bradford came forward with the VA documents still in her hand. "Raven, we have his entire file. Everything he hoped for, everything he said. Do you want to know the truth about your father?" As Raven approached the moment of truth, the night held its breath. He had to decide whether to keep on his destructive course or face the truth he had been avoiding for so long. Iron Jack took a position next to Ellie, his voice heavy with experience. "Son, sometimes fighting against other people isn't the hardest. It has to do with our inner demons." The battle for Pine Haven's soul had reached a tipping point, but neither force nor displays of might would determine the true winner. In the wisdom of those who saw that true strength frequently required knowing when to put down arms and confront the truth, as well as in the heart of a son who had lost his way, it would be won or lost. The aftermath of the night's conflict was painted in tones of gray and gold as dawn slowly spread across Pine Haven. Raven sat on the steps of the VA center, his father's military documents strewn across his lap, the light rising behind the broken windows. For the first time, his hands shook as he read, really read, about the man he believed he had known. He never spoke to me about the guys he saved, the nightmares, or anything else. Raven's voice was hardly audible. Sitting next to him, Ellie bore the burden of decades of mending apparent and unseen wounds. Talking about these topics was not taught to men in his generation. They occasionally carried their burdens to the grave in silence. Pine Haven was reviving all around them. Former Black Vipers who had followed Axel worked alongside Veterans Alliance members to remove debris from the street. As similar experiences and points of agreement surfaced, the lines between the groups started to blur. Iron Jack was in charge of the cleanup, transforming chaos into order with his military prowess. He said to Raven, "Your father served with distinction. Just like Ellie, he saved lives. The man I'm reading about in those papers wouldn't want intimidation and fear to be part of his legacy." With his damaged lip from the last altercation still swelling, Axel approached warily. "I found something behind your father's old locker at the clubhouse," he added, displaying a faded photo. The image depicted a younger William Thompson in Vietnam, putting his arm around a soldier who had a striking resemblance to Edward Richardson. Despite the filth and fatigue on their faces, they were grinning. With professional attention, Dr. Armstrong looked at the picture. "At our mass unit, that was taken. Can you make out the medical tent in the distance? That day, your father brought in 3 injured guys and refused to get better until they were stable." In the picture, Raven's fingers traced his father's face. "I always felt like I was blaming the town, the VA, and everyone else for allowing Dad to pass away alone. He wasn't alone, though, was he?" "No," replied Emma Bradford, carrying further files. "People were attempting to assist him. Numerous veterans reached out and offered assistance, according to the record. He simply couldn't believe it. As a peace gesture to heal the remaining differences, Chief Hamilton brought morning coffee for everyone. It's peaceful in town," he said. "For the first time in months. People want to know what will happen next." As people from Pine Haven started to leave their houses in the morning, that question lingered in the air. They discovered the start of something unexpected rather than the fallout from a gang battle. Former adversaries banding together to mend the damage. No longer making a distinction between veterans and ex-gang members, Grace Richardson handed out food from the cafe. Violence had failed to break down walls, but the act of sharing meals started to do so. With their assistance, Edward Richardson eased himself up the steps and said to Raven, "Your father loved this town. He would traverse these neighborhoods and check on folks, even in his worst moments. He simply could not allow them to visit him." Raven observed the hesitancy on the faces of his surviving devoted supporters. "Now, what should we do?" "We can't just," Ellie interrupted gently, "you can. You can take an alternative route. You don't have to share your father's tale." Black Serpent's patches had already started to be taken off the clubhouse wall by Axel. He said, "Perhaps it's time for something new. Something based on deference rather than terror." Iron Jack gave a nod of approval. Veterans Alliance began similarly. After the war, men are searching for meaning. The distinction is that we decided to defend instead of threaten. The mix of individuals now conversing and enjoying coffee on the stairs of the VA center was highlighted by the intensifying morning light. Dr. Armstrong went amongst them, tending to minor wounds from the fights of the night but also paying close attention to stories that needed to be told. Emma called gently, "Raven," while holding another document. "You ought to see something else. The final written request from your father." He requested that the VA's PTSD program get his military pension. Even though he was unable to help himself, he still wanted to help others. Raven felt the realization as if it were a bodily blow. The weight of the revelation caused everything he believed to be true, every explanation for his rage, to change. He saw his own suffering mirrored in the features of his remaining faithful members. At last, he addressed his men and the veterans, saying, "We've been fighting the wrong war, attempting to coerce something that can only be obtained via trust." Ellie saw comprehension dawn on both young and ancient features. This marked the beginning of true change. Small moments of truth that created new opportunities instead of grand gestures or coerced surrenders. A barely 20-year-old Black Serpent member walked forward. "My grandpa worked as a veterinarian. I didn't know him, but perhaps it's still possible to comprehend." Iron Jack gave the young man his hand. "Every Wednesday, the Veterans Alliance meets. Discuss topics that civilians may find difficult to comprehend. You're really welcome. You all would." Pine Haven has seen more than just daylight in the morning. It had offered the first glimmer of insight. Bridges were being built across differences that had appeared insurmountable only hours earlier. The battle for the town's soul was far from over. It was changing into something completely different. With deliberate reverence, Raven gathered his father's documents and stood slowly. I must read this entire thing. You must comprehend." With decades of experience in her voice, Ellie reassured him that understanding takes time. "However, you've already started. That can be the most difficult aspect at times." Pine Haven started to feel different as the light rose higher in the sky. Not because the issues had miraculously vanished, but rather because once-enemy individuals were starting to view one another as fellow humans with their own struggles, redemption potentials, and tales to tell. It had been years since the Pine Haven Community Center had held a gathering this size. People stood along the walls, filling every chair. Residents, business owners, veterans, and former Black Vipers were all housed together. Instead of fear, the tension in the room was suddenly packed with possibility. Iron Jack commanded attention without asking for it as he stood at the podium. "We were split yesterday. We're here today to discuss tomorrow." Still wearing his leather vest, but with the Black Serpent's patch ripped off, Raven took a seat in the back row. The vacant area seems to symbolize all of Pine Haven's changes. Axel had gathered the ex-gang members who had decided to remain by his side, their faces displaying a mix of hope and uncertainty. Iron Jack went on to say that restitution is the first priority. To fix damage to nearby businesses, the Veterans Alliance has set up a fund. A whisper swept through the audience. Raven rose slowly. "No, we caused the damage. We will correct it ourselves." Grace and Edward Richardson, who were seated in the first row, raised their voices. "How? The majority of you aren't actually rich from earning a living." "We're skilled," Axel replied. "Painters, builders, and mechanics. Perhaps we have been misusing them, but we can make good use of them." Emma Bradford emerged with a suggestion. "Funding for employment training programs is available through the VA Center. We are able to offer certification and respectable job chances." Dr. Armstrong, who had been silently watching, offered his own viewpoint. "Rebuilding trust is more important to healing than simply repairing structures. That requires everyone's time and dedication." 3 additional Black Vipers members entered the room in the middle of the meeting, their faces apprehensive but defiant. Since they hadn't been present during the altercation the night before, their presence now caused tension. Ellie kept a close eye on them, seeing how they sought direction from Raven. In the hours since he had read his father's documents, however, Raven had changed. Rather than responding violently, he got up and approached his erstwhile brothers. He told them quietly that a lot had transpired. "We need to hear a lot of the truth." Scorpion, a young man who was one of the arrivals, scoffed. "The truth? You seem to have softened." "No," said Raven in a firm voice. "Disappeared. There are things you need to know for the first time since my father passed away. Things I had never comprehended before." Chief Hamilton approached, braced for conflict, but Iron Jack held up a hand. "Let them figure it out. They must navigate this on their own." As Raven pulled his former members aside to continue the discussion, he shared what he had discovered about his father, the community, and the true meaning of strength. Now, it was up to them to decide whether or not to listen. Plans for a new community center program were presented by Emma. "We're going by the name Bridge the Gap. By sharing their stories, veterans aid others in comprehending the price and significance of actual duty." Unexpectedly, Axel added, "Not just veterans. Some of us also have stories to tell. Perhaps different kind of battles, but they still need to be told." As comprehension grew, the mood of the room changed. These were more than just old rivals coming together. They were individuals finding that despite their differences, they had common humanity. As Grace Richardson passed around coffee and donuts from the diner, barriers were being broken down by the simple act of sharing food. She stopped close to Raven and, with the same deference she gave to everyone else, offered him coffee. "Your dad used to visit the diner," she muttered. "He informed us that we reminded him of nurses who had assisted him in Vietnam and that he always left extra tips for new waiters." Raven took the coffee, his hands quivering a little. "Continue to learn more about him than what I had previously imagined." More residents of the town started reminiscing. William Thompson performed modest deeds of kindness that his irate son had overlooked, such as repairing a broken-down car and consoling the widow of a fellow warrior. However, not everyone was prepared for the shift. A few ardent Black Vipers members stood outside the community hall, watching the meeting through windows, their faces black with disgust. They viewed their former leader's decision to go a different route as treachery rather than atonement. Dr. Armstrong was inside talking about organizing a weekly support group. He clarified that everyone affected by war bears scars. Sometimes via generations, and other times directly. Both must be addressed in healing. Ellie, who was sitting close to the front, witnessed everything. The advancement and the opposition, the optimism and the hesitancy. She had previously observed this pattern in field hospitals where injured men were forced to choose between healing and resentment. Iron Jack spoke softly as he joined her. "Not everyone will make the correct decision." "No," Ellie concurred. Seeing Raven's intense but non-aggressive motions while he explained something to his former brethren. "However, as we did in Korea, we give them a chance. Treat the visible wounds and pray they have the strength to mend the ones we are unable to." With plans for Pine Haven's future developing, the gathering went on into the afternoon. Outside, however, the members of the Black Serpent mounted their motorcycles, the snarling of their motors announcing impending resistance. Real change was never simple. Ellie was more aware of this than most. It was not the end of the battle for Pine Haven's soul. It has recently entered a new stage in which the lines of conflict were not between individuals but rather between various interpretations of what it meant to be strong and part of a community. For precisely 3 days, Pine Haven was at peace. A flurry of boulders, each wrapped with a message, smashed the windows of Richardson's diner on the 4th morning. First to die are traitors. Scorpion had spent those 3 days rallying other illicit gangs to support the recalcitrant Black Serpent. They had returned with the intention of punishing individuals who they believed to be betraying their fraternity. As Edward and Grace cleaned up, Raven stood amidst the shattered glass. He read one of the texts, and his face tightened. The club is no longer the focus of this. They're personalizing it. Iron Jack conducted a military-level assessment of the damage. First striking the diner. Symbolic. Attempting to disrupt the catalyst for change. Members of the Veterans Alliance had already positioned themselves defensively outside, their presence caused